know if you've noticed, but our country is losing its marbles. Its trust marbles, as it were. Trust in this country is at an all-time low. And I'm not just talking about the government. So this is a graph done by, I believe it's by Edelman Trust, their Edelman Trust Barometer. This is a company that studies trust. And it's looking at the decline just in a 3-4 year period from 2014 to 2017 across from government, media, nonprofits, and businesses. And you can see that across the board, organizations, trust in organizations have been declining. Now, trust has been broken by so many organizations. I mean, think about it, like, let's look at, say, financial organizations like the Lehman Brothers and their scandals and the recent financial crisis. I guess it wasn't that recent, but it seems like it was. Of course, there's the media and the fake news cries. There's churches. And with the Catholic Church with pedophilia, and then, of course, there are those churches that say that they welcome everyone, but only if you look, act, and love like I do. All of this, big businesses like Enron and Exxon, Volkswagen with their emissions debacle, and even the entertainment and sports figures. That whole industry with Harvey Weinstein and the other celebrities exposed in the Me Too movement. All of this has created this incredible distrust of organizations. It's got to the point where even companies that most of us use maybe even on a daily basis, whether it's Apple or Amazon or Target, we just look at with kind of a skeptical eye. Almost any organization, any business now is almost automatically suspect. And I see it sometimes in the eyes of visitors sometimes when they come here. If I approach them kind of like, what, gonna proselytize to me? I don't know, And I get that because that was exactly how I felt when I first came to a UU church. I wasn't quite sure. The thing is, we've all been betrayed so many times, whether it's directly or indirectly, that we have so little trust left. And here's one of the more scary things about the lack of trust. There is, according to political scientists, a direct correlation between trust in the government and growth of the country. So this is by the Pew Research Trust in the government. In fact, social scientists will tell you that trust is absolutely key for a democracy, right? Democratic governments can't exist without trust. You have to trust the process. If distrust is too high, democracies crumble. How many of you remember the Gore-Bush election of 2000 and the hanging chads, right? Yeah, here you had, so this was funny because my brother, he mentioned this, he speaks fluent Spanish and he was down in Central America. And they were saying to his friends that he was meeting there, they're like, okay, so the son of a former president is running and the outcome of the election depends on a state governed by his brother, and the county where the Chads issues is dominated by that party. And y'all are okay with this? Right? In countries where there's low trust, this might have resulted in a revolution or at the very least huge protests. And instead the American people trusted, however grudgingly, okay, we trust this democratic system. That's the way it went. We trusted it to work whether for good or for not. There was enough trust that we read bad intentions or fraud, that we didn't read all that much bad intentions or fraud into the election. Now, I'd say the vast majority of people, I'm sure that there are some that didn't. Would we do that today if one of the opponents included Donald Trump Jr. and the brother was Eric Trump or Jared Kushner? I kind of wonder. If you've been paying attention to the news, you know that it looks like there's an election tampering going on in North Carolina. They're calling for a re-election because of it. And this kind of tampering, it erodes trust in the system. Although I will say that the tampering was caught because when you have an increase of 81% of Republican votes in a highly Democratic county, you didn't think people were going to catch in on that? I'm not sure. So I'm glad that the system caught it. But our U.S. government and our U.S. culture is becoming more and more distrustful, and rightfully so. I feel like we've been betrayed so many times our marble jar is running low to empty. And this lack of trust that leads to cynicism, denial, defensiveness, constant criticism, there isn't a lot of acknowledgement or appreciation going on. Sometimes even to outright contempt of CEOs and of politicians. And in fact, if I mentioned this last time really briefly, some of you might know of John Gottman. He's this relationship expert who talks about marriages, and he says that there are the four horsemen of the relationship apocalypse are criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling. That's when you say, I'm just not even going to talk about it. And contempt. If you've got that in any relationship, you're in trouble. When it happens, relationships go downhill. We humans, we're relational beings. We have relationships not just with people, but with our government, with businesses and other organizations. But here's the really odd thing. While trust in organizations is going downhill, trust in strangers is increasing. How many of you here have used either Uber or Lyft? How many of you have done Airbnb? So here's the thing, 5 million people ride per day worldwide on Uber and Lyft. They get into a stranger's car, right? And 2 million people in any given night around the world are sleeping in a stranger's bed. Stranger's house, really, I should
That's better.
It's interesting. How is it that we trust strangers, that we're willing to get in the car with the stranger and stay at the stranger's house? Well, this is something that Rachel Botsman, she's an Oxford professor and expert on trust, and she believes that we are going through sort of a social evolution, a phase of social evolution around trust. And we've actually been through these evolutions before. So she says, originally trust was created at the local level, right? Up until about the mid-19th century, where you knew everybody personally. If you needed a loan or you needed something, you knew everybody, you knew your neighbors, right? Then, around mid-19th century, up until recently, there was the institutional. This is when urbanization happened. We had so many people packed together that you couldn't possibly know everyone. And so faith then got put into organizations and institutions. But what we're going through now is what she calls distributed trust. That's the current evolution. So let me explain a little bit about how this works. So institutional trust was by its nature a closed system, right? An organization is a closed system. It's opaque, it's centralized, it's licensed, it's top-down in the way that it words things. So in other words, the institution gets to decide how much interest rate you get to have. They get to decide what the sale is, all that sort of thing. But distributed is different. It's by its nature, it's transparent, it's inclusive, it's decentralized, accountable, and bottom-up. I don't know if you've ever noticed, like when you take your Uber ride, you get a choice of how much you want to pay, right? You get to choose. And on Uber and Airbnb and these types of organizations, you have accountability on both sides. Both sides can review the other. You can get banned as an Uber driver and as an Uber rider. I don't know if you're aware of that, if you misbehave. And the same thing happens with Airbnb. Matter of fact, Rachel, she talks about how, in her hotel, when she uses the towels, she kind of just leaves them on the floor. But when she goes to an Airbnb, she makes sure she hangs it up and kind of straightens up before she leaves, because she wants to make sure she doesn't get trashed. And all of this is sort of saying things like Etsy and eBay are also sort of taking advantage of this new trust economy. So let's look at a little bit about how trust is built. Why is it that we're willing to get in a car or stay in a stranger's home? And I think it has to do with how trust is built. Why is distributed trust increasing and why is institutional trust failing? So let's look at that now. So Brene Brown, as from our reading, she works, as I mentioned, with organizations around building trust. But she also talks to people just about relationships in general. And she came up, because she's Brene Brown, with this really clever way of remembering what she calls the anatomy of trust. It's using the acronym BRAVING. Okay? So let's break it down. So if you want to build trust, or you want to break trust, if you want to build trust, one is you have to have boundaries. So in other words, I trust you if you're clear about your boundaries and you hold them, and you're clear about my boundaries and you respect them. R is for reliability. You do what you say you're going to do. And we have to be very clear, honestly, about our limitations, right? So we don't take on so much more that we fall up short, right? So that we can deliver on our commitments. That's being reliable. A is for accountability. I can only trust you if when you make a mistake, you're willing to own it, apologize for it, and make amends. And vice versa, that you allow me to do the same thing. V is for vault. It's poor Ellen in our story, right? What I share with you, you will hold in confidence. And you do not share things with me that are not yours to share. Because then my trust in you is diminished. This is the basis for frenemies, right? When we gossip with someone, I tell you about that person over there. I is for integrity. I like her definition of integrity. She has 3 things she says. Integrity is choosing courage over comfort, choosing what's right over what's fun, fast, or easy, and practicing your values, not just professing your values. Non-judgment, N. What that means is that I can fall apart, ask for help, and be in struggle without being judged by you. And you do the same for me. And G is for generosity. In other words, we assume the most generous thing about my words, my intentions, and behaviors, but you also check in with me about them. Is that what you meant? Help me understand. We don't stonewall or give the cold shoulder. That's the anatomy of trust. If you want to build it with people around you, if you want to put marbles in the jar, look at doing these things. If these are the components of trust, then where are our institutions falling apart? It starts becoming actually really pretty easy when you start breaking it down into this anatomy. So boundaries, right? Our boundaries are not respected. In fact, we're often being manipulated. So think about, for example, like recently I was looking up online, my sister told me about this class on drawing animals, and I was like, oh, I'll check it out. So I looked it up, this website. It didn't seem like a big or busy website. It's just this guy who does these videos on how to draw animals. I'm like, oh, that's kind of interesting. And I've been debating about whether or not I want to actually purchase one of his packages and everything. So the next day I go on Facebook. What shows up? Right? You know, we're in this kind of echo chamber, and it's a new form of censorship. Then there's reliability. Now, most companies, they think that this is all of what it takes. If I give something reliable, that's all it takes to build trust. But if they don't, we immediately do dismiss them. It's not enough anymore. Accountability, accountability, that's a big one. There's no accountability for businesses. They get bailed out of the financial crisis, and then the people have to pay the price for it, right? There's foreclosures and bankruptcies, but they don't. Oh, sorry, I keep doing that. Vault. So our privacy, of course, think of Equifax and people getting hacked. We no longer trust our information out there. As a matter of fact, a recent survey by Business Insider found that 81% of Facebook users have little to no confidence in it to protect their data and privacy. That's pretty high. And then, of course, integrity. How many here trust a CEO to act with integrity? Will they choose courage over what's fast, fun, or easy? I remember before I became a minister, I was working for AT&T Wireless. I started working for AT&T Wireless. And they, at the time, within my first year there, they were getting bought out. And it came down actually to 2 companies that were bidding for AT&T Wireless. One was Vodafone, which was a European-based company, and the other was Singular Wireless, owned by Bell South, right? And it was really kind of, there was all this anxiety in the organization because we all wanted Vodafone because we knew, since they were European-based, that they wouldn't then get rid of a lot of things in the US, right? They would still need to have a lot of the infrastructure. But we knew there'd be a lot of layoffs if Singular Wireless took over. Well, it turned out it was Singular Wireless that took it. And the reason why the CEOs accepted their offer was because they got a huge bonus. And I remember the CEO was getting on the phone and had an open phone call with the employees to talk about what was going on with them, with all of this. And somebody brought this up because it had been leaked to the press. And the CEO's response was, well, I don't make the rules on how these things happen. Like, really? This is why we don't have trust, right? So now non-judgment, now maybe this one isn't a big one when it comes to businesses, right? Businesses don't necessarily judge us, but I do think that it becomes huge when we talk about how we're treated, particularly if we're someone who is a person of color, LGBTQ. How is that judgment being placed out onto us? There's a judgment of worth. Then of course generosity. I don't know about you, but do you always feel like people are sort of nickel and diming you? Like, do you remember the days on airlines when your bags were checked for free, you got a meal, you didn't have to pay for it, right? It's like this, there's this sort of thing that people just constantly want to make more money off of you. There's no generosity there. And I think we don't notice, like, really? You didn't think we were gonna notice that? Now, distributed trust solves some of these problems, but not all of them. There's a lot more accountability, and that reinforces integrity and reliability to some extent. And I'm sure that distributed trust will have its own issues, but in the meantime, one can't help but wonder, what if we had a more distributed democracy, right? Where reviews of politicians and only the highest reviewed got elected. Wouldn't that be interesting, right? And then you were accountable for what you said and your vote as well. Because right now, votes are all secret, but what if they weren't? What if everyone was held accountable? Now, there's a lot of talk in business around the economy of trust right now. There's TED Talks, there's books, tons of it, all of it out there. So some of this is working itself out in the revolution, but what about our personal relationships? All of these things affect those as well. Now, it may not be distributed trust, but the anatomy of trust certainly does figure in there. What are the little ways that we ourselves put in marbles and take marbles out in our relationships? Would we offer a half-butt seat to a friend? You know, one of the things that Brene Brown points out, she says, if you have trouble trusting others, how's your own marble jar? It's easier to trust others when you trust yourself above all else. So how are you being reliable? How are your boundaries? How are you as a Volt? You know, trust is such a fundamental part of what it means to be human. And being human means being in relationship. Trust creates a sense of safety so that we can be vulnerable with those closest to us. And every time we do something that is about creating connection, whether it's empathy or compassion, love, support, non-judgment, we put marbles in the jar, right? And trust is then eroded through things like criticism, contempt, defensiveness, cold shoulders, stonewalling. Relationships break down when that happens, and marbles then go out of the jar. And you know, we exist in this culture, this society in relationship. Beyond business or government, everyone around us is in relationship with one another. And that anti-oppression work that this country is really struggling with, and our own denomination is dealing with, is all about creating relationships of trust as well. A person can feel deeply betrayed by their culture when, for example, as a woman, feel unsafe to walk alone at night, or even to go on an interview and not get harassed. You can feel betrayed when you just wear sweats or a hoodie and you're harassed. You can feel unsafe just holding hands with a loved one. Being unsafe is a form of distrust. It becomes after betrayal and betrayal and betrayal, whether it's direct or indirect. So how do we rebuild trust as a culture? How do we help everyone feel as if they can trust those around them? Well, here in this church, and in other places, but here in this church, we're trying to put more marbles into the jar of trust. It's going to take a lot of marbles. But every time we choose courage over fun and easy, and we have a difficult conversation about racism or sexism or ableism or ageism or whatever it is, we put a marble into the jar of those who have been betrayed. Every time a white person listens to with an open heart and believes a person of color who tells us how they've experienced racism, then a marble is put into their jar. Every time we believe a woman when she says she's being harassed, we put marbles into their jar. Every time we use the right pronoun when we talk about a transgender person, we put marbles into their jar. Every time we reach across the political divide and not dehumanize someone, we put marbles into their jar. And of course, we're not going to be perfect. Sometimes it's going to happen where a marble will be taken out because we make a mistake. But the idea is if we can put more marbles in the jar than those that we take out, we're running ahead. I like to think that it's pretty much like every time we live our principles. You know, the mission of this church is to transform our communities and ourselves by living our principles. And in order to transform our communities and ourselves, it begins with trust. So join with me here. Every time we affirm and promote the dignity and worth of someone, we put a marble into the jar. Every time we work for justice, equity, and compassion, we put marbles into the jar. Every time we accept one another and encourage spiritual growth, we put marbles into the jar. Every time we exercise a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, we put marbles into the jar. Every time we use the democratic process, we put marbles into the jar. All right, let's say it like you mean it. Every time we work toward a goal of world community of peace, liberty, and justice for all, what? And every time we respect the interdependent web. Every time we live our principles, we are putting marbles into the jar. Every time we are willing and we are open to the light of change, we put marbles into the jar. Let us sing.